I woke up to lavender in the air, wind chimes on a property I never decorated, and the soft hum of Kenny G coming from a structure I'd locked weeks ago. That was my first clue. The second, a woman in a pink robe sipping tea on my boathouse deck, acting like I was the intruder. Her name, Karen, and by the time she was done healing, I was about to teach her what real spiritual detachment felt like, starting with a tugboat. It was 6:02 a.m. when I first heard the faint, unmistakable chime of wind chimes, except I don't own any. I sat up straight in bed, still groggy, thinking maybe a storm had knocked something loose on the dock. But then came the unmistakable smell of lavender and vanilla candles wafting through the window that was followed by the distant sound of smooth jazz. Kenny G Day, I don't hate jazz, but I definitely never installed a speaker system in my boathouse for it. My gut twisted as I grabbed my coat, threw on the nearest pair of boots, no socks, and marched down the gravel path behind my house that led to the lake. My property, mind you, private lakefront, with a boathouse I'd locked up tight 3 weeks ago after hauling in the last of my kayaks for winter. As I rounded the bend and caught sight of the deck, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing barefoot on the wooden planks like some suburban mermaid, was Karen. She was wearing a pastel pink kimono robe that looked like it had been smuggled out of a home goods clearance bin, one hand wrapped around a mug that said "Serenity Now," the other casually tossing breadcrumbs to ducks that weren't even there. My boathouse door stood wide open. A large pink flamingo float bobbed lazily against the dock, tied to my cleat post. From inside came the hiss of a milk frother and the unmistakable clatter of my own cookware. She saw me and gave a little wave like I was the one trespassing. "Oh, hey," she said, voice soft like a yoga instructor. "I was hoping you'd sleep in today." It took me a full 5 seconds to register the absurdity of what I was looking at. I managed to stammer out, "What the hell are you doing in my boathouse?" She smiled, took a sip, and said with complete calm, "I thought it was abandoned." The energy felt neglected, abandoned. The structure had solar-powered motion sensors I'd installed myself, not to mention a brand new lock on the door and a bright red sign that literally read, "Preferable property, no trespassing." I pointed at the sign. She shrugged. "I thought it was metaphorical," she said. "You know, like boundaries we need to overcome." She turned her back on me and walked inside like she'd just wrapped up a TED Talk. I followed her in and nearly slipped on the new shag rug she'd rolled out across the deck floor. My fold-out chairs had been replaced with white beach loungers. My cooler was now a hydration station stocked with cucumber water. There were potted succulents on the windowsills. Someone had drawn a chalk mandala on the ceiling beam. I don't even own chalk. Trying to keep my voice steady, I told her she was trespassing, that this was not HOA property, and that the boathouse was on my land, legally, by deed, zoning, and probably even divine intervention. She just smiled, opened a drawer, and pulled out a laminated HOA brochure. "According to our community wellness clause," she said, pointing to a line with her pink polished fingernail, "shared waterfront spaces that are not in active use may be temporarily revitalized for mental health purposes." I blinked. This isn't a community space. I don't even live in the HOA. Her face shifted for the first time, just slightly, before returning to that serene smugness. "Well," she said, "that might be something we can work on together." I should have kicked her out right then. I should have called the sheriff immediately. But in that moment, I was too stunned to react. Too many things were happening at once. Her complete lack of shame, the scent of essential oils fighting my allergies, the faint sound of Tibetan singing bowls playing from a Bluetooth speaker in the corner. She gestured to a yoga mat laid out in the middle of the floor and said, "You're welcome to stay for the sunrise meditation. This space is all about community release." I looked around at what used to be my fishing cabin and suddenly realized I wasn't in a boathouse anymore. I was in someone else's delusion, and her name was Karen. I didn't stay for sunrise meditation. Instead, I turned around, walked back up the hill to my house, locked the door behind me, and made the strongest pot of black coffee my machine could handle. The absurdity of what just happened hadn't even settled in yet. My boathouse, my structure on my land, had been transformed into some kind of lakeside cult headquarters, complete with throw pillows and scented crystals. And the woman doing it wasn't some random squatter. She was Karen Montgomery, self-appointed wellness chair of the Hickory Springs HOA. a title she'd created herself last year after a failed petition to ban wind chimes due to auditory chaos. I knew she was a problem, but I didn't know she was this unhinged. After the caffeine hit my bloodstream, I did what any sane landowner would do. I called the sheriff's office. I explained that someone had broken into my property, refused to leave, and had effectively converted it into a lavender-scented hostage zone. The dispatcher sounded polite but unconvinced. "Do you have evidence of forced entry?" she asked. "The locks," I said. "She changed them." There was a pause. Then, "Sounds civil, sir. We'll send someone to check on it." An hour later, a deputy arrived, but not before Karen had time to brew a second pot of tea, decorate the porch railing with prayer flags, and set out a tray of gluten-free muffins labeled Community Nourishment. When the deputy approached, she greeted him like an Airbnb host. "Welcome, officer. Would you like some herbal detox tea? It's dandelion root-based. Very grounding." I stood there watching in disbelief as Karen handed over a folder she had prepped with laminated HOA statements, local wellness zoning codes, misinterpreted obviously, and a flyer that read Project Float and Glow, a healing initiative for lakefront renewal. The deputy opened the file, flipped through a few pages, then looked at me and shrugged. "Looks like a civil issue, unless you've got a lease, deed, or proof of forced entry." I pointed to the no trespassing sign, now partially covered by a dream catcher. He chuckled. "She said you weren't using the space. Says she's reclaiming it temporarily for emotional recovery." I wanted to scream. Instead, I pulled up photos on my phone from 3 weeks ago. The padlock, the empty deck, the sealed windows. He glanced at them but didn't commit. "Best course of action is to file a complaint in court." Karen, meanwhile, stood next to us with the poise of a woman convinced the earth rotated at her command. She had on oversized sunglasses, a new robe with embroidered lotus petals, and was now lighting incense while humming something that sounded vaguely like Enya. Before the deputy left, she handed him a business card. I kid you not, a glossy, custom-printed card that said, "Karen Montgomery, Holistic Environment Consultant." I stared at it like it was evidence from a completely different universe. The deputy handed it back politely and nodded toward me. "Sorry, sir, file with the county clerk." Karen waved at him as he left, then turned to me and said, "You really should try the muffins. They're CBD infused, great for tension." I almost bit through my own tongue. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by every piece of documentation I owned. Property deeds, zoning maps, HOA boundary filings, and 3 different copies of my tax receipts. I wanted to be ready, but as I sifted through the paperwork, I found something I hadn't expected. A clause in the original Lakefront Covenant agreement from 1994 about structures unmoored from fixed foundation. It was legal jargon about floating docks, but the way it was worded got my gears turning, because if a structure wasn't anchored to land, then technically it wasn't real estate, it was a vessel. And vessels fall under an entirely different set of laws. A plan began forming in my head, not loud, not confrontational, but deeply, poetically satisfying. And it started with something I saw for sale on Craigslist, a rusted tugboat named the Boundary Breaker, located just 1 county over. The next morning, I drove out to Dawson County with a thermos of coffee, a notebook full of legal scribbles, and a silent prayer that the Boundary Breaker was still available. The listing said runs but needs love, which in Craigslist speak usually means may or may not explode on contact with water. But when I got there, the thing was more solid than I expected. Ugly? Absolutely. The paint was chipped, and one of the railings looked like it had been chewed on by a bear, but the engine purred with a bit of coaxing, and it had just enough horsepower to tow a small house. I called Carl, my brother-in-law and part-time marine mechanic, and asked if he could help me prep it for a project involving lawful relocation of an unlawful occupation. He didn't ask for details. He just said, "Hell yes." Over the next 3 days, Carl and I worked like dockyard goblins. We changed the battery, patched a small hole crack, tested the throttle, and reinforced the tow hitch. All the while, I kept checking on the boathouse from a distance through binoculars. Karen was still there. She'd added a second mandala to the dock, installed a wind chime shaped like a crescent moon, and started hosting what she called sunset intention circles with neighborhood women in tie-dye yoga pants. One evening, I caught a glimpse of her handing out little glass bottles labeled Lake Essence, Another time, I watched her conduct what I assume was a chakra alignment involving a crystal, a singing bowl, and a confused golden retriever. Her delusion wasn't just expanding, it was franchising. But while she was busy channeling moonlight through lavender oil, I was preparing a legal checkmate. I met again with Monica, my lawyer friend, and laid out the plan. We drafted a cease and desist letter citing trespassing, misrepresentation, and unauthorized modification of private property. But we added something new, a warning that if the structure was unmoored and relocated, it would legally be designated a vessel under maritime law. Subject to entirely different enforcement protocols, Monica even included case law about detached dock structures being reclassified as non-residential craft once removed from permanent foundation. "This is nuts," she said, grinning, "but it's airtight and, honestly, kind of brilliant." We made 3 copies, one to take to the boathouse door, one to mail to the HOA, and one to slide under Karen's $80.00 faux rattan yoga mat. Karen's response came the next morning in glitter pen. I found it taped to my mailbox, written on lavender-scented stationery, "Nice try. This is a sacred aqua zone. Your threats are a manifestation of repressed masculine fear. Namaste." Attached was a sticker that said, "Lake Love Warrior." I didn't know whether to laugh or call a therapist, but one thing was clear. She wasn't leaving. She had doubled down on her spiritual siege, and that meant it was time to escalate. Not through confrontation, not through legal jargon. She'd already weaponized delusion. No, the next move had to be silent, strategic, and surgical. Carl and I prepped the tow line in secret under cover of darkness. The tugboat was now moored at the far end of my shoreline, tucked behind a willow tree, out of Karen's sight. The rope, already looped through the slats beneath her boathouse, was hidden, waiting. The lake was calm. The timing was near perfect. But I wanted one more card to play, one last irrefutable piece of evidence that could end this in court if necessary. So I pulled out the hard drive from the old raccoon cam I'd installed inside the boathouse a year ago. Originally meant to catch teenage trespassers or the occasional drunk fisherman, it had recorded everything since Karen's invasion, and there it was, high-definition footage of her climbing through the window with a pillow under her arm, muttering, "If he shows up, I'll just say I'm healing." It was the smoking gun, the proof of intent. I clipped the footage, saved it in 3 formats, and backed it up to the cloud. As I watched Karen lead a group sound bath under the soft glow of string lights she'd strung across my roof beams, I smiled. She thought she had the upper hand, but in 48 hours, she was going to find herself in a very different kind of sanctuary, one drifting in the middle of the lake, far from Wi-Fi, power outlets, and HOA jurisdiction. By Thursday evening, the lake was as still as glass, and Karen was oblivious. That day, I watched from my upstairs window as she added a 4th mandala to the side of the boathouse and repotted some kind of ornamental grass into a planter she labeled Energy Realignment Fern. Her Bluetooth speaker played ambient harp music all afternoon, and at one point she recorded a live video titled "Full Moon Flow on Sacred Water." She wore a flowing kimono with moons printed down the sleeves and spoke in hushed tones about trauma release, standing in front of my fishing gear like it was an altar. The footage was pure comedy gold, but I didn't laugh, not yet. I had one final checklist to complete, and I didn't want to jinx it. Carl and I spent the next morning double-checking everything. Fuel line tight, tug cables secured, route plotted across the lake, beyond the HOA boundary and into neutral water, where property lines became legally meaningless. We kept the tugboat hidden, tucked behind the old willow grove where the shadows from the trees kept it mostly invisible from Karen's line of sight. That night, as planned, I posted the formal cease and desist letter on the boathouse door. Monica had included her law firm's header just to give it extra weight. We cited 3 sections of North Carolina's zoning code, 2 federal maritime definitions, and closed it with a paragraph that read, "Failure to vacate will result in lawful relocation under state and lakefront vessel codes. This is your final warning." Predictably, Karen responded in the most Karen way possible. The next morning, there was a handmade sign nailed to one of the dock posts. It read, "Welcome to the Lake Wellness Sanctuary, members only," in glitter paint, surrounded by stick-on rhinestones. She'd even installed a cheap garden arch at the foot of the walkway and wrapped it in plastic ivy. My boathouse, now the set of a low-budget cult documentary. The kicker? She added a laminated schedule titled Holistic Flow Journey that included time slots for guided breathwork, journaling, float therapy, and something called aquatic energy reclamation, which I assume was just floating on an inflatable unicorn while humming at the moon. I stared at it all in silence. It would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so rage-inducing. But I didn't engage. That was the key. The HOA had ignored me, the sheriff had shrugged me off, and Karen had turned illusion into performance art. Arguing wasn't going to fix anything. I needed to change the venue, literally. And that's exactly what we did. At 4:43 a.m. on Saturday, under the cover of dense lake mist, Carl fired up the boundary breaker. It groaned once like it resented being woken, then rumbled to life with a satisfying growl. We both wore dark clothes, not for stealth, but for dramatic effect. We moved like stagehands on opening night. Carl gave me a thumbs up as I pulled the hidden tow line from beneath the slats and locked it into the cleat. I felt the slack tighten. The boathouse gave a slow creak, as if annoyed, then started to move. It was surreal. The boathouse drifted slowly from the dock, gliding like a ghost across the steel surface. Curtains fluttered through open windows. A dream catcher swayed gently from the awning. Inside, dim battery lights cast a warm glow over the space that Karen had meticulously transformed into a healing zone. But there was no stopping now. The legal boundary was marked by an old buoy halfway across the lake. As we passed it, I felt a strange kind of satisfaction. Not triumph, not revenge, just clarity. The boathouse was no longer on my land, no longer my problem. Karen would wake up soon, and when she did, she'd find herself in the middle of open water, drifting, untethered, and completely free of any legal ground to stand on. Karen woke up just before dawn, right as the first streaks of sunlight broke across the lake. From my vantage point on the far shoreline, I saw the silhouette of her figure behind the boathouse's lace curtain, yawning, stretching, blissfully unaware that her spa kingdom had been set adrift. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. She stepped out onto the small deck in her usual silk robe, mug of tea in hand, and it took her maybe 10 full seconds to register that something was off. She looked to her left, nothing but water. Looked right, more water. She did a full turn, slowly, like someone trying to wake up from a lucid dream. Then she froze. Her mouth opened, her mug tipped slightly, steam rose, and finally she shouted, "Hello?" I ducked behind a bush to avoid being spotted, but I could still hear her. "Where's the shore?" she yelled. "Where's my dock?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she whipped out her phone, pacing in small frantic circles like a castaway in a kimono. Within seconds, she was yelling into the receiver, "Yes, I'm floating. No, I don't know where I am. I was meditating and now I'm abducted." She paused, clearly frustrated. "What do you mean it's not a kidnapping if the house is floating?" There was a long silence. Then she shouted, "I'm not trespassing. The house trespassed me." I had to press a hand over my mouth to stop from laughing. The absurdity of it all was so perfect, it could have been written by a screenwriter on edibles. And then came the cavalry, on a jet ski. I recognized the HOA treasurer, Brad, speeding across the water in a neon life vest with the HOA seal ironed on like he was part of some suburban Coast Guard. Karen screamed his name and waved her arms like she was signaling a rescue chopper. Brad pulled up, tossed her a rope, and shouted, "Tie it to the porch, I'll bring you back." Karen fumbled with the rope and looped it around a deck post. Brad throttled the engine. The jet ski revved and the rope pulled tight, but the boathouse barely moved. The structure rocked, groaned, and then came the snap. The rope snapped with a loud crack, flinging backward and knocking Brad clean off the jet ski. He landed in the water with a yelp while the jet ski spun in slow, mocking circles. Karen shrieked and leaned over the railing, shouting instructions that Brad, now soaking and sputtering, couldn't hear. She tried calling 911 again. This time I could hear snippets echoing across the lake. "Yes, I need maritime assistance. No, it's not a boat, it's a house, but it's moving against my will." Pause. "It's a floating structure of sacred purpose, and I demand to be reattached to Earth." The operator must have said something unsatisfying because Karen's voice shot up an octave. "This is spiritual assault." Then, as if things weren't theatrical enough, she pulled out her phone and started live streaming. "My name is Karen Montgomery," she announced, eyes teary and eyeliner smudged, "and I have been aquatically exiled by a bitter neighbor afraid of feminine healing power. I am being silenced, canceled, set adrift by toxic patriarchy. And the internet ate it up. Within an hour, clips from her live stream were already circulating Reddit and TikTok, tagged with hashtags like Karen Adrift, Wellness Wreck, and Spa Castaway. One user stitched it with Wilson from Castaway, while another superimposed sea shanty music under her crying. The more she spoke, the more outrageous it became. I am a prisoner of the lake, she declared, waving a Palo Santo stick like a flare, and I will not be silenced by boat thieves. I didn't post a single word. I didn't have to. Karen had just become the star of her own public unraveling, and the lake was now her stage. By noon, the lake wasn't just quiet water anymore. It was the center of a social media storm. Karen's live stream had been clipped, duetted, subtitled, and turned into a dozen formats before lunchtime. Someone made a remix of her screaming, I am a prisoner of the lake, over a dubstep beat. Another edited her waving her Palo Santo stick into a lightsaber duel against herself, and my personal favorite, a TikTok that simply showed her yelling into the void with the caption, when your HOA membership doesn't cover boat insurance. Within hours, the hashtag Karen Adrift was trending regionally, but the true wildfire came when someone dug up an old HOA newsletter from 3 months ago, where Karen called a neighbor's mailbox aggressively whimsical and tried to ban inflatable pool toys as aesthetically hostile. The internet loves a villain with receipts. Karen, of course, doubled down. She posted another video, this time from inside the boathouse, hair wild, camera angle way too close, voice trembling with theatrical purpose. I've been targeted, she whispered. This was not just a removal, this was a psychological assault. The comments instantly turned into a roast session. People quoted her in memes like, Namaste, now get out, and my trauma floats, therefore I am. One guy even photoshopped her onto the cover of Survivor, Hocho Island. By sundown, the video had over 700,000 views, and I'd received 3 texts from neighbors saying, is this real? Followed by links to BuzzFeed-style articles like Floating Spa Queen claims victimhood after being relocated by tugboat. I still hadn't said a word publicly, but the silence, it turned out, spoke louder than anything else. Inside the HOA, things started cracking fast. Greg, a longtime resident and unofficial historian of Hickory Springs, stood up at the impromptu community meeting held that Saturday and addressed the elephant in the lake. We've gone from overgrown lawns to floating therapy cults, he said dryly, and I've had enough. Dozens of residents showed up, many who had laughed off Karen's antics before, but now felt the shame by association seeping in. HOA President Linda, whose main platform last election was Harmony Through Standards, tried to steer the meeting with a PowerPoint titled Reclaiming Community Spaces. But once she clicked to a slide graphing Neighborhood Serenity Disruption Index, people started shifting in their chairs. Then came the public comments. One woman asked, if it was really a wellness center, why'd she call the cops on the property owner? Another asked, why is our HOA name being used to endorse lake witchcraft? The murmurs turned to head shaking. By the end of the meeting, Linda's tone had shifted from defensive to apologetic. We will be reviewing the bylaws and addressing any misapplications of community access language, he said, which in HOA speak basically means we screwed up and we're trying not to get sued. And just when the room began to settle, an envelope was handed to Linda, served officially by a third-party process agent. Inside, a lawsuit filed by another neighbor claiming the HOA had violated fiduciary duty by enabling and indirectly funding Karen's occupation through misappropriated wellness programming funds. That's right. Turns out, Karen had quietly filed for a small community development grant 6 months ago under the name Float and Glow Lakeside Renewal. And the HOA approved it, allocating nearly $1,800, 0 cents, from their discretionary fund for waterfront beautification and mental health enrichment. The grant was never discussed publicly. When exposed, it lit the meeting on fire. People demanded resignations. HOA members panicked. Linda's voice cracked as she promised full transparency moving forward. But it was too late. The community had turned, and the HOA had just been caught sponsoring a rogue lavender cult adrift on stolen property. Back at my house, I sat on the porch sipping iced tea, watching the now empty patch of water where the boathouse had drifted out of view. Karen's jet ski rescuer Brad hadn't been seen in 2 days. Rumor had it he'd told his wife he was just helping a friend, and now she wasn't answering his calls. As the sun dipped lower over the lake, I opened my laptop and reread Monica's message. "They've lost the narrative," she'd said. "No, you don't need to push, just steer." And that's exactly what I intended to do, because I had one final move left, and it involved a silent auction, a custom plaque, and a title that would immortalize Karen's spa empire forever. By Monday, the boathouse had become more than a floating embarrassment. It was a cultural artifact. Local media had picked up the story under headlines like "Lavender Drift," "HOA Leader's Spa Retreat Goes Rogue," and "Floating Sanctuary" or "Unauthorized Nautical Nightmare." National Reddit threads dissected every detail, from the improvised crystal grid on the deck to Karen's infamous Palo Santo meltdown. My inbox filled with inquiries. A few people asked if I'd press charges. Others wanted to rent the boathouse for photo shoots. One guy from California offered to buy it outright as a floating podcast studio, but I wasn't interested in profit. I wanted something better, poetic closure, with a healthy dose of public performance art. After that week, I officially transferred ownership of the boathouse to a shell LLC I created just for this occasion, Lake Justice Holdings LLC. It cost me $75 and 5 minutes online. The reason? Simple. I didn't want the final act to be about property. I wanted it to be about legacy. So, with Monica's help, we drafted an auction listing titled "Karen's Island, a fully furnished floating wellness center, lightly used, spiritually saturated." The description read like a parody real estate pitch. Includes original Palo Santo stick, used once under distress, deck blessed by multiple unlicensed ceremonies, HO-free guarantee, former occupant not included. I added a walkthrough video with deadpan narration highlighting amenities like CBD muffin tray holder and chakra realignment platform, formerly a kayak rack. The internet went nuts. Influencers reposted the listing with laughing emojis. A travel blogger commented she wanted to turn it into an off-grid rage room. A guy in Brooklyn said he'd floated in the Hudson as a performance protest. Bidding exploded. Within 48 hours, we were over $15,000. But I didn't stop there. I made one last addition, a gold frame plaque mounted inside the main door, engraved with the words, "Here floated the last queen of entitlement. May all who enter leave their ego at the shore." The photo of the plaque went viral on its own. It was screenshotted, memeified, and turned into t-shirts by day 3. The winning bidder was a tech entrepreneur from Oregon who made his fortune designing virtual escape rooms. He sent me a message that just said, "This is the most absurdly brilliant thing I've ever seen. Also, my wife's name is Karen. She's going to scream." We arranged delivery for the following weekend. Carl helped me tow the boathouse to a private loading dock, and the transfer went off without a hitch. But before it left for good, I invited a few neighbors, Greg's, Felicia, even Monica, to say goodbye. Greg brought folding chairs and popcorn. Someone hooked up a Bluetooth speaker and played Celine Dion's "My Heart Will Go On." As the tugboat pulled the structure out of view one final time, Felicia raised a can of sparkling water and toasted to peace and to never hearing Inya echo across the lake again. That night, I posted one and only one photo, just the plaque on the inside of the door, lit by the soft glow of solar string lights. No caption, just the image. It was shared over 30,000 times in 24 hours. I received no angry messages from Karen, no cease and desist letters, no live videos about forced spiritual eviction. She had gone dark on all platforms. Her Instagram, once a steady stream of bathrobe selfies and herbal tea tips, had been made private. Her house, according to Greg, was quietly listed with a local realtor 3 towns over. She was gone, drifted away like the floating empire she built on arrogance, sandalwood, and HOA delusion. And for the first time in weeks, the lake was still. But the story wasn't quite over yet. Not until the new HOA election rolled around, because change was coming, and her name wasn't Karen. The new HOA election came just 3 weeks after the Boathouse saga reached its viral crescendo, and the turnout was the biggest Hickory Springs had ever seen. People who hadn't attended a meeting in 5 years suddenly showed up with clipboards, yard signs, and enough passive-aggressive baked goods to stock a church basement for a month. The message was loud and clear. No more lavender coups, no more rogue sanctuaries, and absolutely no more HOA-funded emotional enrichment initiatives. Karen, unsurprisingly, didn't show up. Her name wasn't on the ballot. She had, it seemed, faded into exile somewhere upstate. Rumors swirling that she was looking to start a floating wellness commune on a different lake. I'm not sure any of them will take her. I hear even the HOA at Lake Minnow banned Palo Santo after seeing the memes. Felicia Santiago, a longtime resident and part-time nurse practitioner, won the presidency in a landslide. She ran on a platform of transparency, accountability, and what she called post-Karen recovery. Her first act in office? Amending the bylaws to include what she dubbed the Karen Clause. No HOA member or board official shall enter, utilize, or appropriate any property not directly under HOA jurisdiction, regardless of use status, decor style, or perceived energetic void. It passed unanimously at the next community meeting. Felicia joked, "If you want to find yourself spiritually, try yoga, not breaking and entering." The room erupted in applause. As for me, I didn't say much. I didn't have to. My boathouse was gone, yes, but in its place, I created something better. I converted the empty shoreline into a public fire pit area with a few benches, some solar lanterns, and one hand-carved wooden sign that reads, "Welcome to the shore. No incense beyond this point." It became a quiet, shared space. Neighbors who used to wave awkwardly now came down for marshmallows, stories, or just to listen to the water. Greg started bringing his dog. Felicia hosted a sunset potluck. Even the guy who used to blast Kid Rock at 7 a.m. turned the volume down and started greeting people with namaste, ironically. The lake feels different now, lighter somehow. Karen's retreat was never about healing. It was about control wrapped in patchouli. But in her wake, people remembered what community's actually supposed to feel like. Not rigid rules or fake spiritual posturing, but real boundaries, mutual respect, and the kind of laughter that starts slow and ends with someone nearly choking on us some more. I still have the plaque from the boathouse door. I kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Entitlement can dress itself up in anything: authority, spirituality, even healing. But eventually, it floats too far. And when it does, the best response isn't anger or drama. It's a tugboat, a smile, and the quiet satisfaction of watching justice drift off into the fog where it belongs. Sometimes the most powerful word in the English language is no. No to entitlement, no to weaponized wellness, no to self-appointed HOA cult leaders with glitter pens and dreamcatcher diplomacy. This wasn't a war. It was a reminder that boundaries matter, that property lines aren't just fences, they're lines of respect. And when someone floats across yours with a mug of herbal tea and a laminated pamphlet, you don't need to yell, so you need to tow, because the best revenge isn't fire, it's drift. Let their delusion sail, let their ego untether, and let the world laugh with you, not at you. And when the dust settles, or in this case the mist, light a campfire, share the story, and build something better with your neighbors, not in spite of the chaos, but because of it. Justice doesn't always need handcuffs. Sometimes it just needs a tugboat and Wi-Fi.